This is a Woodstock Classic. It's a traditional chef's knife design. It's made from a quality durable steel, more on that later. It costs $170 and I love it. These are also chef's knives, but they're much cheaper. In fact, all three combined are only just over half the cost of this Woodstock. So are expensive knives really that much better? Can you get a good cheap knife, or should you just save up for the real deal? Some of the answers might surprise you. When looking for a knife, the number one thing you need to look for is a quality steel. Don't worry, you don't need to be a steel expert, you just have to check for two simple things. And then checking for a quality steel becomes super easy. These are Western style chef's knives. They're made for durability rather than the Japanese style of knife, which are usually made for edge retention. The Japanese style tends to be easier to damage and are generally more specialized. So here we're going to be focusing on steels which suit this durable Western style of knife. Every knife listing should clearly label the steel type. It's usually a red flag if it doesn't, and some knives even have the knife steel printed directly onto the blade. Once you have it, put the name of the steel into Google followed by Z Knives. It's a great website which quickly and clearly shows the steel composition, i.e. the amount of all the different elements that make up the steel. This might look complicated, but it's really not, because with my method you only need to pay attention to two of the elements that are listed here. This $170 chef's knife is made from a steel called X50 CR MOV15. The 15 stands for 15% chromium, and chromium is the first element that we're looking for in any steel's composition. Chromium is the element that stops the steel from rusting, and you want a chromium level of at least 13%, preferably 14%, and they don't tend to go higher than 18%. The second number that you need to be looking for is the carbon content. You'll see almost every knife advertise itself as a high carbon steel. It's usually nonsense, and truly, most people don't need a high carbon knife anyway. I classify high carbon as knives near to or above 1% carbon content. That's what you'll find in good Japanese knives. It makes the knife harder but also more brittle. Western knives are made for durability, so for that you want a carbon level that balances enough hardness to maintain a decent edge with enough durability so that it's not always chipping. Higher than 0.4% and below 1% is a good place to be. So for a good durable steel, you want your numbers to fit between here and here. The other elements have an impact too, but you're not studying for a chemistry degree here. The chromium and carbon levels give the best quick indicator of a decent steel, so you can easily check whether a knife is likely to be any good. So we've seen the Woodstock steel, but what do the cheap knives use? Well, this is where things get interesting. Victorinox are unfortunately less open about the exact steel they use. They don't tend to list the steel type directly, but after conducting research and contacting Victorinox directly, I believe this knife uses a steel called X55 CR MO14. That contains a decent level of carbon, but a lower and wider range of chromium, certainly than the Woodstock. The indicators are that this is a decent steel, and Victorinox, by the way, are an awesome company. They're the original creators of the Swiss Army knife. They're still the biggest supplier of knives to the Swiss Army today, so they know a thing or two about making durable knives. God knows why they don't publicly share the steel types for each of their knives, because when I actually asked them, the steels they used were generally quite decent. This Mercer Millennia uses X30 CR13. I'm a big fan of the Mercer Renaissance series, which actually uses the same steel as the Woodstock, but the steel for this cheaper Millennia series contains pretty low levels of both carbon and chromium. Maybe that's to be expected given the low price, but I wouldn't think this knife is able to keep a sharp edge for very long. We'll find out for sure later on. This Dalstrong, a knife I've been really looking forward to testing, uses 7CR17 MOV. It advertises it as a high carbon knife, and whilst it is higher than the other knives, I wouldn't personally consider any knife below around the 1% mark to be a truly high carbon knife. Anyway, the chromium and carbon levels are both strong, which tallies with what I've heard about Dalstrong knives. They're made in China, but unlike many Chinese brands, the materials they use are actually supposed to be quite decent quality, resulting in quite a good product compared to the price, but I'll be putting that to the test in this video. Looking at those together, the first indications seem to show that the Victorinox and the Dalstrong appear to use a pretty decent raw steel when compared with the Woodstock, given that they're a quarter of the cost, whilst the Mercer currently does look lower quality. But the steel type isn't the only thing that makes a good knife, so all isn't lost for the Mercer. Another important factor that most decent brands will show right up front on their product listing is the HRC, or Rockwell hardness. It's a measure of how hard the knife blade is. A harder steel will keep a sharper edge for longer. Just like the steel type, if the HRC isn't made available by the manufacturer, it's probably bad news. For a durable Western style chef's knife, we usually get a HRC between 56 and 58. Lower than this and it won't hold an edge for very long, higher than this and it'll usually be prone to chipping more easily along the blade. Now the steel type is not the only thing that contributes to the HRC. You can even have two different knives using the exact same raw steel, they both have different HRCs, and the main reason for that is something called heat treatment. The basics of that are when a knife blade is being made, it's superheated, quenched and then tempered. This is done specifically to harden the steel, and so different parameters of that process will change the resulting HRC. Looking at our four knives, the Wusthof and the Dalstrong have the highest HRC, and the Victorinox and the Mercer have the lower HRC, meaning their blades should get more dull more quickly. And I'm going to be physically testing that later on in the video. But first, I want to compare these knives directly and tell you what the differences are, starting with the weight and balance. Weight is a bit of a personal preference. Personally, I prefer a heavier knife with a perfect balance between the blade and the handle, which I think gives more control and sturdiness to the knife. I think that's most people's preference, but some people do prefer a lightweight knife, so let's weigh them. It comes as no surprise when we weigh them that the Wusthof is the heaviest knife. It's the only one made from forged steel with a half bolster and it's got a full tang. The other three are all stamped steel and the blade just continues straight into the handle. Another test that I like to try is the balance of the knife. Is the weight of the blade and the handle distributed evenly? Now that type of equal weight distribution isn't everyone's preference. Some people like a blade heavy knife so that the blade naturally falls forward when you're cutting. But the reality is that most people do prefer a perfectly balanced knife, and that's why most high quality Western style chef's knives will have a perfect balance between the blade and the handle. This is evidenced by the Wusthof, which has a perfect balance between the blade and the handle when you hold it on the bolster. The second best is the Mercer, which only falls forward slightly when you try and hold it in the middle between the blade and the handle. Third is the Victorinox, which has quite a bit of forward heavy weight when you hold it there. And last place definitely goes to the Dalstrong, which just points completely downwards when you hold it in the middle, completely blade heavy. Part of the reason for that forward heavy weight is the Dalstrong's handle, which is made from a super light thermoplastic, and I think it's the worst handle of the bunch. It looks cool, but because it's lightweight and has a really smooth surface, it's actually sitting on the verge of being slippy. I think it's been designed for its kind of modern appearance rather than proper ergonomics. The Mercer probably has the best grip out of the knives. It's really well designed and super comfortable with basically no risk of slippage. It is a little bit thick though, so people with smaller hands might find it a little bit large. The Victorinox also has a great grip, it's nice and comfortable, and it's a little bit thinner than the Mercer, which some people might prefer. All three of these knives use a cheaper thermoplastic material for the handle, while the Wusthof uses a more premium POM. So they aren't really comparable to the Wusthof in the handle department, which comprises of a half bolster, full tang and triple riveted handle. However, I don't actually think the Wusthof handle is as comfortable as the Mercer and the Victorinox. And those two cheaper knives actually have a more solid grip than the Wusthof. So not everything is just about durability and quality of materials. And that's one of the reasons these much cheaper knives can actually often be quite nice to use. When it comes to the shape of the knives, the Wusthof and the Mercer are trying to emulate that classic chef's knife design of the Wusthof, which is pretty much perfect. Whilst the Dalstrong clearly has some kind of Eastern influence, like a bit of a Kyoto chef's knife cross. But for me, it just doesn't really give the best benefits of either. Both the Mercer and Victorinox have these nice long heels, giving plenty of room for your fingers. They are really quite similar. Personally, I prefer the Mercer design ever so slightly, but both do a good job of emulating that classic chef's knife design of the Wusthof. So I'm ranking those two the highest for comfort. Unfortunately for the Dalstrong, it's the least comfortable of the bunch. I've seen another review of the Victorinox saying that the blade isn't aligned with the handle. This one looks perfectly aligned, as do the other three, so it looks like that's something they've fixed. No problems there. We evaluate these things because we want to understand how the knife is to use, how comfortable it is, how versatile it is. Wide blades with big heels make cutting through larger food easier. The curve of the blade allows for rock chopping motion, and the good grip of the handle reduces the chances of slippage and accidents. But of course, over time, all the use of the knife is going to make it dull, and that's what I want to test next. Edge retention is one of the most important factors of any knife, so let's take a look at how long these knives stay sharp. The vast majority of knives will come from the factory with a razor sharp edge. It's generally accepted amongst the knife community that testing the factory edge of a knife is a bit of a waste of time. What really matters is how long the edge will stay sharp before you have to sharpen it again. This is where I expect the Wusthof to really show its superiority, but let's see what $170 really gets you. I'm going to test the sharpness of the blades using this sharpness tester, I'll then pass each of the blades along this dulling block to see which knife gets duller quicker. I'll do the sharpness test 3 times for each knife and take an average to try and be as fair as possible. You'd expect the results to correlate with the manufacturer's stated HRCs, but let's see for ourselves. So let's start with the Wusthof. Whoa, that is sharp. That is ridiculous. Okay, 65, first one. 105. So different bits of the blade are naturally going to be different levels of sharpness. That's why I'm doing 3 tests to try and get a decent average for the whole blade. 65 again. So that gives an average of 78 for the Wusthof. Let's move on to the Mercer. 145, 155, 185. So that's an average of 162. Onto the Victorinox now. 135, 185, 145. That's an average of 155. And now let's try the Dowstrong. 200, 200, whoa, 100. That's a sharper bit. So that's an average of 167. So to give that some kind of reference, anything below 350 is considered a sort of new high-end cutlery edge. So all of these knives are performing really well. The Wusthof is definitely sharper, but the 3 cheaper knives all have pretty equal sharpness. And to be honest, around the 150, 160 mark here puts it right at the bottom of utility razor blade sharpness. So that is perfectly sharp for any kind of kitchen need. Let's try and dull them down now and see which one gets duller quicker. I'm going to try and apply the same amount of force for each knife as much as I possibly can. I don't like doing this. Okay, let's start off with what was the sharpest knife. It's made a big difference, 385. 630. 660. So that's a new average of 558. The Victorinox was the second sharpest, so let's see what difference it's made. 360. 525. 430. So that brings an average of 438. Surprisingly beating the Wusthof. Okay, let's see how the Mercer gets on. Wow, 865, 665, 610. So that's the worst so far at 713. And finally, let's try the Dowstrong. Remember, this one has the highest carbon content of all the knives, so you'd expect this to do okay. $310. 490, 325. So the Dowstrong, despite being the least sharp knife to begin with, is actually the sharpest knife after dulling them down. Clearly there's something in the high carbon content of this knife. Well, I've got to say, I think those are some pretty interesting results, and we're seeing some things that I don't think are coincidences. The knife with the highest carbon content, the Dowstrong, performed the best, whilst the knife with what we thought was the worst steel and by far the lowest carbon content, the Mercer, by far performed the worst. But what's also interesting is the Wusthof, the $170 Wusthof, didn't really do anything massively impressive. And I suppose that's because all of these steels are made for a similar thing. They're not made to be super hard, they're made to be durable. And whether you're paying $30, $40 or $170, there's still that same basic principle. They're just trying to be durable steels, they're not trying to stay sharp forever. But then that does beg the question, why spend all that money? If you're just looking for a knife that's going to stay reasonably sharp and you want it at a decent price, perhaps go for something like the Victorinox. It's super comfortable, it's nicely designed, and it's performed pretty well on this sharpness test. But now that we've evaluated the hardness of these knives, there's still one really important factor that we need to test, and that's what I'm going to do next. It's about the rust resistance. One of the advantages of using Western style stainless steel knives is that they aren't supposed to rust, or at least they aren't supposed to rust easily, but I'm going to put that to the test. To create rust we need three things: iron, water and oxygen. The reason these knives are resistant to rust is because of the high chromium levels. Chromium is a very active element, and as such it reacts with the oxygen before the iron has a chance to react with the oxygen. And once the chromium reacts, it creates a thin layer of chromium oxide over the blade. That chromium oxide layer prevents water and oxygen from reaching the iron, thus preventing two of the elements that are needed to create iron oxide, aka rust. A knife is at its biggest risk directly after use, where you may have removed some of that chromium oxide layer. And if it gets wet before that layer's had a chance to reform, there's more opportunity for rust. So I'm going to put these knives through some harsh treatment to test them out. They've been used to cut food, they've been scraped along the dulling block, they've been scraped along the cutting board. First I'm going to put them into the dishwasher, a hot humid environment, but one they should be able to survive. And then I'm going to put them in this dish of water and leave them overnight.
24 hours later.
We got rust. Okay, so they were soaked in water for about 24 hours. I've taken them out now and let them air dry for a few hours. Now let's take a look at them. I want to start off with the rust off, which has some pretty surprising results. The blade looks pretty much okay. The edge is basically entirely untarnished. There's a little bit of a rust mark on the face of the blade itself. I would hazard a guess that's because it was pressed against one of the other knives during the time, and it's probably got a bit of remnants from that knife as well. The actual edge of this blade looks perfectly fine. Where we've got some really bad results for the rust off is the tang on the handle. The strip that's exposed all the way along the back of the handle and underneath has started to completely rust. It's really quite bad. It's the worst out of all the knives. Obviously the only other knife that has an exposed tang handle like that is the Strong, so we can't compare directly. But I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised that the rust off has rusted to this extent. Okay, so let's look at the Strong next then, the other one that has a tang exposed throughout the handle. It's nowhere near as rusted along that tang as the rust off is, but you can definitely still see that it's started to begin. That rust has started to build up, particularly near the bottom of the handle, near the hilt of the blade. The underneath side of the handle looks pretty untarnished, to be fair. That's all looking quite good. Most of the blade looks okay, but we've got this really bad rust mark here closer to the tip. It's probably the strongest individual edge rust mark from all of the knives, and that's the very part of the knife that you don't want to rust. Okay, so let's take a look at the Victorinox next. Obviously this doesn't have any exposure on the tang or anything like that, so it's just what we can see on the blade. To say from first impressions, the blade looks reasonable. There are a few spots of developing rust on one of the sides of the blade, a few little spots on the blade face itself, and then you can see a little bit of rust starting to develop along the middle of the edge. So it's not escaped completely unharmed. I can already see that the Mercer looks to be in pretty good shape. I can't see any major bits of rust developing on the edge. There's a tiny little bit nearer the end of the blade where you can just see a spot starting to develop. If we left it in the water longer, that would definitely get bigger. But it's really not too bad. Again, it doesn't have any exposure on the tang, so we're really just looking at the blade itself. So definitely all three knives have suffered from some kind of rust with that combination of putting them in a dishwasher and leaving them in water for 24 hours. Not something that I would recommend you do with any of your knives. But these knives are built for durability, and we want them to be able to survive a certain amount of moisture, because the reality in the kitchen is that they're going to experience it. What I'm really impressed with here is how well the cheap knives have done. From the cheaper knives, probably the one that's got the worst bit of rusting is the Strong. It's got this quite strong little patch on the edge of the blade, exactly where you don't want it to. Obviously the other two cheaper knives don't have an exposed tang, so it's not really that fair to compare, but we can definitely see that tang starting to rust as well. I'm impressed with what the Mercer's done, really impressed with the Victorinox as well, very little damage. Super surprised that the rust off has rusted so badly, especially on the handle. If you bought that $170 knife and just left it in the kitchen sink by accident overnight, you would be pretty gutted to see that in the morning. However, that is just on the tang, and the bit that actually matters is the edge of the blade by far, and there isn't any rusting really along the edge of the blade. There's a little bit on the face here. Again, I think that's probably because it was in contact with one of the other knives that was rusting a bit more. But how much more rust resistance does a knife that costs 4 or 5 times the price of these other ones give you? Well, it turns out not very much. So here are my final scores, and although the Wusthof does get the highest score, quite a lot of the categories that it performed well on are sort of personal preference categories. Things like the shape and the comfort and the weight of balance, which might be different from person to person. What I found really interesting doing these tests is actually the base fundamentals of the knives are often quite similar. The Wusthof hasn't massively outperformed these knives when it comes to things like rust resistance and endurance of the edge. So honestly, I can't really say that paying 4 or 5 times more the price really gets you that much better of a quality knife for the money. Now that depends on your budget, and if you're happy to spend that kind of money, it is a really comfortable, great to use knife. But if you want a knife that's just really good value for the quality of product that you get, you can't look much further, I think, than the Victorinox. It's comfortable, it hardly rusted, it kept its edge quite well. It's just a great all-round knife. And maybe that's no surprise given Victorinox's rich history in knife making. And as I mentioned earlier, actually being able to sharpen your knife properly is much more important than the sharpness of the factory edge. So to find a great sharpener, you should watch my video here where I test sharpeners from $4 to $60 to see which is the best for you.